McLaren's title-fighting teammates Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri have finally collided properly on track, and the team now finds itself in a right mess over interfering with their title battle. Norris's wheel-banging pass on Piastri on the opening lap of the Singapore Grand Prix was not fully investigated by the stewards, and McLaren opted to take no action either, despite Piastri's clear anger at what Norris did. The immediate justification was that Norris hit Piastri because he had to avoid Max Verstappen, but we'll get to that slightly limp rationale, why Norris wasn't punished by his own team, and what the consequences of that are later in this video. We've been waiting for this kind of clash for a long time. Apart from Norris clumsily driving into the back of Piastri in Canada and wrecking his own race, the two have had several near misses, and there have been simmering tensions around strategy, team orders, and the dreaded papaya rules. This proper position-changing clash, which helped Norris cut Piastri's lead to 22 points, and that McLaren actively chose to let go, is a significant moment. It heaps fresh scrutiny on its policy with its drivers, and clearly had a much bigger impact on Piastri than any other flashpoint has so far. That wider context is critical, as the wheel-banging between Norris and Piastri is a classic example of what can happen on the first lap. Harsh on Piastri, but not particularly surprising to see the stewards let it go, as it happened in the first sequence of corners and was between teammates. What makes it more controversial and complicated is McLaren's laudable but flawed ongoing attempt to guarantee fairness between the two. Piastri took serious issue with what Norris called a small correction, saying he barged him out of the way, and outright called it not fair when told by McLaren they wouldn't be doing anything about it. The problem with McLaren's drive for fairness is that you can talk about hypotheticals all you like, but there's so many scenarios that can arise that will be open to interpretation. Piastri was told to control the controllables by race engineer Tom Stallard when he was complaining in race, but perhaps McLaren is guilty of trying to control the uncontrollables with the extent of how it tries to manage fairness between the drivers and has effectively overpromised on what it is possible to manage. That always had the potential to create flashpoints during the title running, and it has already, which means McLaren has played a key part in the obvious tension that clouds what should be a day of celebration given it won the Constructors' Championship. When Norris attacked Piastri through the opening sequence of corners and tried to complete the move into the turn 3 left-hander, the complicating factor was that Norris only bounced into Piastri because he hit Verstappen first. It was clumsy and not deliberate. Norris said the last thing he wants is to collide with Piastri, and half-jokingly said it's especially because all I get is questions from you guys, but this was not really anywhere near the threshold for stewards to intervene. Norris was also adamant that he wasn't being aggressive with Piastri directly, and that was just a consequence of a normal bit of racing with Verstappen. However, if you consider Verstappen to be a legitimate mitigating factor for Norris running into Piastri, then you also have to consider that the Verstappen touch only happened because Norris was being aggressive in trying to overtake Piastri. We can't really begrudge him that approach, as he needs all the points he can gain on Piastri to try to turn the tide in their championship battle. And as Norris said, if you fault him for trying a move on the inside when he was entitled to go for it, you shouldn't be in F1. But with that risk Norris is taking comes a responsibility not to hit his teammate. That's not even a terrible papaya rule, it's the well-established #1 rule of racing. Norris failed in that regard, and the contact changed the race. As Norris himself admitted, if he hadn't made the places he did on lap 1, he probably never would have. So the question is, how far are you required to go as a McLaren driver to avoid contact with your teammate? Given what McLaren has done on other occasions, Piastri clearly saw this as a situation that demanded intervention as well, because it wasn't a fair pass. And to quote him, Norris did a shit job avoiding Verstappen if it meant hitting his teammate instead. McLaren will review how it handled this because contact was made, but essentially it disagreed with Piastri and felt Norris hadn't crossed the line, marking a clear distinction between how the incident was perceived by the aggrieved driver and the team that's twisting itself in knots trying to stay fair. To elaborate, here's John Noble from the Singapore paddock to explain what he saw and heard firsthand from Piastri and team boss Andrea Stella's stance.
Both Oscar Piastri and Andrea Stella were very diplomatic tonight in their responses, but you could tell from Oscar's body language and kind of the way he was being very controlled in what he was saying that he was very frustrated with what he saw and what played out on the track today. He hadn't seen the incident from the TV replays when we spoke to him in the pen, but he says, once I have a full picture of this, undoubtedly we will speak about it. And this follows on what happened at Monza when the events there where he was asked to give up the position to Lando. There were, from what I understand, robust conversations with McLaren days afterwards about, what are the policies, what are the racing rules, what is fair and equitable. And I think this is what the conversations will be again in McLaren in the coming days. I asked him actually whether he felt this McLaren's push for fairness this season, had things been totally fair all season. There was there was a bit of a pause, but he says, ultimately yes, but he says things have been better at certain points. So I think there are, as this championship gets closer to the end, as the points get more closer, the championship fight gets more closer between Lando Norris and Max Verstappen, even there appearing now in the background, that every single element is going to be more critical. From Andrea Stella's point of view, he says they'll review it. They want to look at it and they will do it in forensic detail, he said. So it's important to understand the details. It's important that they're very analytical in how they go through this. And it's very important they get the feedback from both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri in terms of what they feel about things. McLaren's pushed hard to be fair. And there's a very interesting remark from Andrea at the end. He says, we need to be accurate because there is a lot at stake. And I think he wasn't just referring to the World Championship, because as we get towards the end now, things are going to get more critical. But he said this is about trust with the drivers. I think the key thing McLaren needs to retain, that is kept pretty much intact so far, is the trust from both drivers, that they're both treated equally, that the elements of fairness are shared across the garages, and that when we get to the end of this championship fight, it has been won by the best driver, not a driver who's been handed the position by the team swapping things around.
Piastri's in-race anger was justified, because from his point of view, he's been bounced out of the way by his teammate, and Stella is on record previously saying the McLaren drivers simply aren't allowed to make contact. Piastri will therefore see contact being made not through any fault of his own, and McLaren refusing to pull for him the levers of justice they so readily use to rectify a slow pit stop for Norris at Monza. Team Piastri will no doubt be watching closely to see if there are any consequences behind the scenes after all of this, or if it's just brushed off entirely. If it is, it sends a clear message to Piastri, who has never been so prickly over the team radio before and pushed back several times. He also made a couple of remarks later in the race too, including congratulating the team on building the car strong during the slightly forced post-race pleasantries over winning the Constructors' title. But his radio messages conveyed his true feelings, and even though he said all the right things afterwards, the obvious frustration remained. So there's no escaping this created a new tension at McLaren, particularly as it brought the ultra-cool Piastri to boiling point in the race. With all this in mind, what happens when you have a driver who understandably feels he's been on the wrong side of the implementation of the agreed McLaren racing rules twice in the past 3 events? Piastri could, and just might, ignore any McLaren request in the name of fairness over the final races. It would be wrong to fully equate this with what happened at Monza, as just because McLaren ordered Piastri to let Norris by there after a slow pit stop didn't mean it was obligated to intervene again here. They were different incidents and probably fall on different sides of what you say is just racing. But in Piastri's position, what obligation does he now have to play overly friendly? He could justifiably say, I moved aside because of your blunder with Lando at Monza, but you've not corrected his blunder here. This was always the problem with McLaren picking moments to intervene. The team can contend this was just racing, and Piastri claims he won't change how he races Norris because of this, but it encourages Piastri to do exactly the same back to Norris in the future. And he will if he needs to. The Constructors' title is now wrapped up, so it's every McLaren man for himself in pursuit of the driver's crown.